Oh, Daniel, you're muted if you're talking to us.
Yes, that's the case. All right, welcome everyone to the Cluster Addons meeting. It is the 3rd of March, and I see we have a bunch of new folks on the call. Does anyone want to quickly introduce themselves and maybe say a few words what your interest in Cluster Addons is? That's fine. Yeah, if you want, you can also add a few words to the agenda doc. That's fine too if you can't speak right now. I had a look at the agenda. We don't have any actions from last time. Yes, so last 2 weeks ago, I added the face-to-face thing at KubeCon. It looks like many are pulling out of KubeCon right now. Maybe we'll wait to see what happens there before we make any plans. Do any of you already know that you're definitely going or definitely not going? Looking at the diagram, I shouldn't go. Like I've been coughing for a couple of weeks already. I really shouldn't go, but I would help with any logistics.
Google has canceled international travel.
Right.
For the moment. I believe others have as well.
I can't go, but for unrelated reasons. So.
All right, let's. Is anyone talking, or did I just hear a faint buzz somewhere? Okay. Yeah, let's just move on to the next thing. Yeah, Justin, I saw there was a new reviewer on the repository, and I had read their name somewhere before, but I wasn't quite sure who it was. Somebody who was involved with operator things.
Yes, I think Jeff also knows the person, as I recall, their name is, so I'm just bringing it up, Atto88, and yeah, they've been doing a lot of sort of contributions, mostly I think in the related declarative pattern repo, if I recall correctly. But yes, they asked to be a reviewer, and so we put them in there.
Super. I think that's much appreciated, especially now that we're having the first few, even though some of code hasn't started yet, we seem to get a couple of contributions already. So having reviewers there is much appreciated. Yeah, and I don't know if just reading the comments on the agenda doc. Yeah, not sure if you all saw the cluster API proposal that came in. I know that Justin and Lee at least were at that meeting. Do you think you could say a couple of words about this? Like, what was your reading, or like how does it fit into the broader scheme of things? Because the minutes, they weren't quite clear enough for me.
Justin, did you have any comments on that? I know that you didn't speak up during the meeting, but wondered if you had thoughts about this applying thing that they were building.
Honestly, I need to review it. I do think it's important, whatever we do, there will be some bootstrap thing that has to happen. So I was basically thinking that this is a bootstrap mechanism that can kick off operators, or it could also be used to just apply the thing itself. I'd rather we kicked off operators, but it could be used for other purposes as well. But it seems whichever way it goes is more about how we execute, and there does need to be this hook in Cluster API.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see the generic like usefulness of it, and the installation library that we built, is pretty thin, and like I think fairly understandable. I'd look if like we could get some buy-in from the cluster API folks to be like, okay, well, we want to run these experiments and get some mileage on this type of interface. Can we actually use the thing that we've been working on and trying to get merged into KubeDM? So, I mean, that's my opinion. It's like we've thought a lot about the kinds of lifecycle problems already and thought about the simplest, most generic thing we could build. And we went and built it. So, hey, can we use it like in this particular place? And what modifications need to be made to support the managing cluster kind of workflow?
So I was quite taken that there was a lot of kind of gung-ho behind that proposal in contrast to where we are with the KubeADM work. I'm kind of interested why. I mean, I guess their proposal looks simpler, but then these things often do until you try and use them. On the other hand, I think in line with what Justin was saying, if it's just about anything that kicks off a workload would do the job.
Yeah, I guess was there a concrete proposal to feed through the KubeADM proposal into a cluster API cluster? Would be like I guess my question. That could be why
the KubeADM proposal, yeah, I guess where the communication lines like get blurred is like cluster API is a very separate project. There's not a lot of the same contributors on both sides of KubeADM and cluster API. And then it's like cluster API already has providers that support KubeADM component config. So like nothing needs to happen in cluster API in order for it to consume that work from KubeADM. But it was a KubeADM specific thing, not a cluster API specific thing. And so now they're talking about building the cluster API specific thing. And that's a really big group of people, who support various initiatives. So they came up with something pretty simple, and it's overlapping work. I think that if we were to just advocate for the same mechanism to be used, then I don't think that would be that controversial.
Can I ask a couple questions about this proposal?
Yeah.
The motivation for having a hook that can apply stuff later is that those API types don't exist yet, or we don't want the controllers to start reconciling those things just yet. What's the motivating issue for the story?
They just want to be able to customize the cluster after it's created. So it's a bootstrap type problem. So even if we're talking about operators, right, like we still need whatever the mechanism is to get those operators into the cluster. So that's the problem space that they've proposed to solve by just storing a bunch of objects inside of config maps, referencing the config maps to decorate the cluster object. And then after the cluster is reported as status created, then the apply operator that they've been talking about in the control plane cluster or the manager cluster then goes and uses the kube config for the created cluster to go apply to that API server.
Okay.
And
so the config map doesn't live in the target cluster where these things are being created.
Yeah, it lives in the managing cluster, and yeah, they have a config map reference style of thing to get around like size limitations and the ability for people to manage different objects. It wasn't clear to me when I first read it, like what namespaces these things are supposed to live in. I think some of that context is probably hidden in other parts of the cluster API proposals and implementation. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty simple mechanism that I think would become a lot more usable and useful if they use the add-on installer configuration API. Since that's designed, to make it easy for people to bundle things from different sources, potentially use the customized OCI packaging in the future, patch, and extend things, reference them, actually remove things with the declarative configuration. Their main use case that they kind of brought up was about like CSI volume plugin, configurations and network policies and stuff like that, which I think is like a very attractive use case for somebody to be like, hey, I want to apply some simple things when I create a bunch of clusters. Like say, some large user and I want to create 50 clusters, then I want to be able to ensure that all of the production namespaces don't talk to the stage ones or something. So
that's helpful. Thank you. I think I misunderstood the goals originally.
But yeah, it basically NCDC and I think some other folks like mentioned that the add-ons working group like was working on things in this area, and the word add-on seems to be still controversial. People keep bringing it up in the proposal, like, hey, can we call this something else? But I think it's a pretty generic term, at least in how we've been talking about it here. So. Anyway, if you have thoughts, go read the proposal. And there's actually a in-flight PR as well by Sedef, who picked up the issue to work on it. She has posted an implementation, and I think it's a good start on things. I think that the actually using the cluster API and having a mechanism that's native to the cluster API is a good idea. It's a new idea, something that we haven't talked about here, which is composing with the authentication and the cluster objects inside of the manager cluster to actually maintain a fleet of clusters and the add-ons installed within them. So if we could just take the mechanism for the application and actually swap it out, instead of making it just this generic strings loaded from config maps, if we could use the add-on installer configuration, add things to that API, and modify the library so that it fits all the use cases, then I think we'd end up in a better place. Because then we'd actually have something more universal. Justin, I'm actually glad that you're on this call as well, because I'd love to chat about writing a COPS implementation, or just getting the add-on installer configuration into the COPS implementation that you already started building. But,
yeah, that'd be great. We should we can maybe meet later in the week or something, or we are in Google Perf season, so but it ends today.
Yeah. Best of luck to you and the folks that you associate with.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to you made a comment about the word add-on, people talking about that. And they did want to stress that their motivation for, well, they're talking about cluster customization or configuring, and they're talking about things that we would not include in what we've called add-ons. So I guess an example might be a network policy. So the scope of the add some YAML after the cluster is created is literally any YAML. Yeah, just to stress that point.
Yeah, I think it gets a little funky when you start like talking about things that require compute versus policies that configure stuff that clusters come with. Like nothing has to be installed, right, for a default Kubernetes cluster to have a network policy be applied to the API. You might need an accompanying CNI that actually can enforce that network policy.
Yeah, it's actually a near perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
It's pure YAML. You don't need any add-ons. Oh, except actually you do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because you need something to implement your network policy.
Yeah. And the same thing with, like a storage class, like depending on where the cluster is created, you may or may not need compute resources that are added on.
Storage class would have been an even purer example.
Mm-hmm. So I would say, like, to me, the policies, the CRDs, the custom resource instances that need to be applied to a cluster, like, even if those things are bundled separately and they don't have other compute dependencies, most will, that still feels like I could call that an add-on, right? It's still something that I want to version manage the lifecycle of. And it's like policies aren't this static thing that's not going to change. People are going to want to update them.
It might be worth mentioning a similar pattern that we've been looking at for operators, which is just that when you have a case like this where you want to have some configuration laid down, instead you create some payload that on startup creates those things if they don't exist. So there'd be some operator added in, and then when it starts, it says, oh, you don't have the default config for your storage, so I created it for you, and you can go and edit it if you want. So that might be applicable here or might not. We've definitely talked about similar problems of like, I want to create a thing right after it's been installed.
Yeah, and just like conversations I've had on the side with people, and Chris is actually on the call as well. We had a talk last week about like the issue of maintaining APIs and the operators or controllers that consume those APIs in the cluster being very hard to tenantize when you're sharing a larger cluster between multiple parties. And I think that the granular bundling of CRDs, the operator itself and its accompanying RBAC, and the custom resource instances, the kind of predefined templates that you might provide for people to actually create instances of those things, they can be versioned and exposed, in the same repository. But I'm pretty adamant about them actually being referenceable as separate entities, and that examples and the way that we should encourage people to install and compose these things, it's like you go from referencing one thing, right, which is like, give me the add-on with all of the like defaults things that I think would be useful for 80% of people, to referencing 3 or 4 things. And that's not actually that big of a difference, right? Because if those things are referenced and exampled and documented together, like it's 4 lines and people can see, oh, I can actually rip the CRD out, right? Or I can, instead of installing the global version of the operator, or the cluster roles, like I can install the namespace specific roles, right? So now I can install 5 of these things on this same CRD, or I can patch the CRD, and I can patch the the operator to reference a different namespace version of the CRD. Like those kinds of things we need to be smart about, or else we end up worse off than before, right? Just a leaky abstraction for bundling things together. And I think that a lot of those kinds of problems, like when people are like, hey, I need to apply a bunch of YAML to a cluster, they haven't thought about the usability of those things. We've had extended conversations in this group and have talked about the way that these mechanisms should be implemented. So I, being biased, but like somebody who's worked and thought about the problem a lot, I see the add-on installer configuration as an API and a library that exposes a mechanism that enables a lot of powerful generic use cases for people to compose things sensibly. And it's about advocating that out to people so that they actually use the thing, and that we establish some good shared patterns across the entire community so that we don't end up with something special.
Yeah, like bringing this back to something we've been, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
something we've been talking about before was that bundling concept and just having a common packaging format. And so for this proposal, if we suggested something like, hey, what if instead of a config map, you just reference standard bundle of YAML, and then that's the thing that gets applied. That might be like enough of a connection point that gets some wins.
I think that's a great idea. What I wanted to sort of ask you about, Evan, was when you talked about this this pattern of when the cluster comes up, having an operator which applies things if they don't exist, as it were. Mm-hmm. What is the source of that? Is it like an image? And I guess like the follow-up question would be like, what about when it sort of changes per cluster, sort of thing? Like, do you imagine people pushing an image per cluster, or what?
Yeah. You're asking Evan that or me that, Justin?
Well, you feel both of me. Feel free. It was prompted by what Evan said, but you can both feel free to chime in and like come up with different views if you want
to. Sure, I'll start. The pattern that we have been using has been that like there's one runnable operator image, and that operator starts up and kind of looks at its environment and decides what things need to be created. And so the way we provide default options for those operators, even if it's like a configuration for a task that the operator would typically do. So like a storage volume provider might be a good example, like configuring a default one, something like that. The operator might start up, say, hey, there's no instance of this CR that I'm supposed to be reconciling, so here's the default one for you. And I've made it based on like the information I've gathered from the cluster. The reason, by the way, that this is what we've been looking at doing is because then when we decide later to update to some other future version, we don't have to worry too much about transitioning those existing resources, because the new operator should start up, see what's there, and have some migration story for whatever existing resources are there.
Lee, it sounds like you might disagree. That makes sense. That makes sense. It feels like there are, that is like I guess that would be like the default storage class example, whereas you might imagine network policy might be a different mechanism, I guess. I don't know if that's what, it sounded like you wanted to say something, I guess.
Well, you're just making me realize that I think one of the main like differences that differentiate approaches is when you can schedule something like into the cluster and you have compute, right? And you can run like code that you ask the user to run. You can do things kind of at this pre-compile stage, right? So if you consider Kubernetes a computer that runs like a bunch of instructions, some of those are policies that restrict the way it behaves. Some of those, make code run. Then like some of those are pre-compile steps, right? Where there's tooling and stuff ahead of the time, like before those instructions hit the API. And then the other bit is like, you can have actors inside of the cluster, like code that you actually run and design that like mutates the cluster through the API. And so there's the runtime, like dynamic introspection, reflection kind of use case. And then there's things that you can do outside of the cluster, like before you actually hit that surface. And so something like managing the lifecycle of a custom resource that is, maintained by an operator, you could do that dynamically from inside of the cluster. But you can also do it from a packaging standpoint, in a pre-compile step, right? Or a pre-apply step before it actually reaches the API by just versioning the package.
Yeah, and I do think that I think they're complementary, right? Like the pattern I described helps when the user doesn't know what they want yet. And the pattern you're describing helps when the user does know what they're trying to configure ahead of time. And they work together, because in the first model where the operator starts up and detects what's there, it just detects that there's an existing user configuration, and it doesn't need to create whatever defaults it normally would.
So would you expect that an operator that has that kind of dynamic introspection, if you were composing it instead, and the custom resource, like the custom resource would predicate the operator, like it'd have to be installed before the operator actually came up and introspected its environment?
Yeah, I would expect some sort of model like that where you say like CRDs first, make sure they're available, then CRs, then start up anything that's actually going to look at them.
So does role-based access does not play into this in the packaging? What can be used and what cannot be used by a specific user or task for the runtime in the operator, as you mentioned?
That was actually one of my biggest questions for Evan when you were talking about like inspecting the environment. Because it's like, yeah, users like often will want to do the opposite thing from how the person creating the operator packages it. And so some operators are like packaged as cluster level operators, and some of them are packaged, at a namespace or several namespace level. And I think that has a lot to do with just the usability of RBAC and the fact that when we bundle things, like we create RBAC rules that are hard to create, that have a purpose. And so the people find like, oh, this is the way that this is supposed to work, not realizing that they can change that. Like not realizing they can decide, oh, I'd like to restrict this thing's permissions, or I'd like to expand them. I don't have to install this per namespace if I want to do a platform level thing. But I think that what you're bringing up, Prakash, is a very important component of the conversation. Is like, how do we encourage people to expose usable, flexible permutations of RBAC rules per add-on for things that need those. And my question for you, Evan, was like, when you were talking about inspecting the environment, was that also like inspecting the RBAC roles themselves?
It can be. It varies for each operator, how much permission they need and how much they're given, and what they're able to check.
Yeah, because you would need read access for the RBAC.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're delegating your administrator permission to these services whenever you choose to install one. But I think it's a thing that people are comfortable doing because they do it with like the deployment controller, right? That doesn't mean that you should do it willy-nilly, but that's roughly the pattern of Kubernetes, I think.
Doing things willy-nilly?
Delegating to a long-running service with very high permissions to actually do the things on the nodes.
Yeah, that certainly has been problematic. Honestly, just the lack of tiered or namespaced APIs was even just in the core APIs. I was chatting with Chris last week, and Chris Hines on the call, and it makes it very difficult to build anything that's multi-tenant inside of a single Kubernetes cluster.
That's something we've bumped into a lot, and I have a lot of opinions about it that I'm happy to share, but I also don't want to totally derail this conversation. So
there's
just
a whole
stop me if
dependency that's working on like all sorts of solutions to that problem. But do you join that, Evan? Or
I used to join it a lot more, but someone from our team joins every time. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Well, from the add-on side of things, just making sure that people are granularly packaging their work, and that we're using a shared installation mechanism to actually get the things into the cluster are some of my immediate interests. So if we could, I'm happy to build, the modifications to the COPS implementation that are necessary to help accomplish that. And then if anyone has any review comments for the cluster API proposal, I'm sure that we'd all appreciate reading your opinions and conclusions. And I'm going to go over there and make some suggestions as well regarding the add-on installer configuration using that API.
I'm wondering if we should invite people from the the proposal to our next meeting, or I don't know, have some kind of breakout session or something.
Both sound like great ideas. We should probably comment on the issue first, and then
right. Makes sense.
We can always carve off half the time here for breakout, as it were, like the second half or something.
Yeah, totally.
Just to add, add-ons are different from supplementing, right? I still have a question that policies are generally supplementary, right? You supplement them after the operator is established, and the policies which are predefined are the way to use, and including the RBAC policies can be supplementary. Is that not the right way? Especially once you are talking of RBAC, it comes to my mind that policies should define those so that it prevents the multi-tenancy issue you mentioned in the, especially with multiple CRDs interaction in a composition.
I think
So
the main problem.
Solution should come from policies to prevent you from doing something or constrain you. It's a constraint, right? Policy is a constraint.
At least from the multi-tenant side of things, the real issue comes from that we have a shared GVK across everything, and most people are still doing, or there are a lot of operators out there that are kind of coming from the side of actually creating cluster scoped resources, and then in a multi-tenant world, since everything lives in a single API server, we run into the issue where a team, for example, has to own a full set of CRDs, and if there are multiple operators in that cluster, one team can technically break somebody else's implementation if they actually like namespace scope them properly. So you end up in this really strange environment where policy doesn't actually stop that per se, or protect you.
You see, maybe it needs more thinking then.
There are also some issues with the way CRDs work in clusters now with conversion webhooks. So you can only have one endpoint in the entire cluster that can convert between API versions, which means that if you have multiple instances, they really need to be like at the same version of the controller, or you don't have multiple instances. It's kind of the best options.
Yeah, our way around that is just to turn it off entirely. Don't use anything like that, which is just not a very good path, but it's all we can do, really.
I think it may be that we have to, I'd say we don't have a great solution for all this yet, and that we may have to restructure our packages into like cluster scoped and namespace scoped, and think very carefully about what happens with skew between those, because maybe we could like forward a webhook into a namespace webhook, but like it just gets really messy, and maybe we just want to version the global, the cluster scoped package very carefully and make sure that everything else is backwards compatible. But then what happens when you mess up, and all these challenges?
I guess I will say that we do have controls for all of these things in operator framework, and they do work. But the user reaction is that they're very difficult to understand. Like getting people who aren't familiar with any of these things, making decisions around, you have someone installing a cluster, they're making decisions around what add-ons are they want to include. Now they have to understand like how controllers work, how RBAC works, how namespace scoping works, how various particular features of CRDs work, just to make the decision of like how I want to install this one particular controller in a cluster. It's very difficult for users to understand. Has been our experience, at least. That's not to say that there's not a good solution there waiting to be made.
Okay, do we want to move on the agenda? Somebody put the Summer of Code project management on there. Whose item was this? It says resolve issues in onboarding and operator generation. Not quite sure what needs to be done there.
It wasn't me, but I was certainly like involved in the GSOC thing, so I will take a look after perf finishes today and figure out where we are on that front.
Super. And here's another one, component config proposal updates.
Yeah, that'd be from me.
And a link. Okay.
Yeah, so I've been working on getting component config added into controller runtime. Still looking for more review. Sean, you're on the line as well if you want to talk a little bit about this, because you had the most recent review. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's only like a couple of things I wanted to bring up. I didn't know if this was the right place or not, but one of the things is, sorry, I'm just reading your comments. I just saw them. I apologize for that.
Yeah, I can give you kind of like the
Yeah.
high level. What I ended up implementing real quickly was an actual implementation of a component config type in controller runtime. I'm going to back that actually out of the proposal and go towards what you were suggesting actually, because I had read what your suggestion incorrectly about an embeddable type, which I luckily found some interesting stuff from the component-based side of things that unfortunately Lee dropped off, but. There's a bunch of already standard types that we can load in to do some of this, like the path to a config file, cube config file, the leader election configurations, the resync timeframes. So there's some stuff that I can already pull in here. Yeah, I basically just need to go and do a couple updates based on rereading what your original feedback.
Yeah, so we're not going to be like scaffolding out a type for somebody and making them manage it. Then we would have. Okay, cool.
Well, so I think we can provide them embeddable components like what you do with type meta and things like that from API machinery that will allow them to do that. I think that's kind of what you're getting at, correct? Not allowing them to extend it how they need to instead of giving them a full type or making them write the full type from scratch.
Yes, and I was also maybe thinking a base default one that somebody could use even if they didn't want to extend it, that did compile all of the things into one, that they could like use as a starting spot. So like you could embed that as your base object and then extend it beyond that. That's kind of what I was thinking, but I don't know if that even makes sense.
I think it does. That is what I ended up implementing. I did not implement the other side, which is the embeddable component.
I think both.
So
yeah. I don't know.
So both would be good. All right.
It's just to see. Anyway, that's just what I was thinking. So
cool. If anybody else has feedback on this as well, Jeff, I know you were originally put in the first issue around adding component config into controller runtime.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that. I haven't had a chance to review that, but I'll make sure that.
Cool, thank you.
Confident things are going the right direction, but I'll take a quick peek.
Sweet. Thanks, Sean, for looking that up.
I was muted. You're welcome.
Great. Do you have anything else? I saw some discussion on the Summer of Code issues. We have two. One of them was about package all the things, and the second one was about the CodeNS operator. Do we feel these are scoped out clear enough? Because I seem to get a bunch of questions on Slack about these.
I don't know, but I will take a look at them from them. I'll take a look at them.
Mm-hmm.
We can always
Just
be
ask-
clearer, right?
Yeah, I was just wondering because I think the original proposal on GitHub wasn't written by any of our group, but it was just somebody who came in and said, "Coordinates, let's do it." And since we have Sandeep on the call, right, I guess we can take a look at these later on.
Yeah, I tried to sort of redirect that to the Coordinates doc I wrote a while ago, and I think that's where that's where I got like a lot of the tasks. But I'm very interested in feedback there. I don't have any experience doing GSOC, so I don't know how defined we need to be or how ambiguous we can be. So keep the feedback rolling if things are not crisp enough or we're kind of heading in the wrong direction.
Cool.
But I'm really glad we've got some Coordinates folk involved. This is awesome.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we have a comment from Emma, AMA, said, we talked about compiling a reading list for Summer of Code. Yes, so I went over the other issue and basically added all the links I could find. So taking a look at the code there, trying it out and reading some of the issues pointed out, I think that's going to be a good start. Because you can always ask in these meetings as well or on Slack if anything is unclear. But yeah, I think things are going to evolve over the next weeks. And I think it's even, I don't know, 8 weeks or something until Summer of Code starts. So we still have some time.
I've been thinking about should KubeCon not go ahead, like content that might be well done virtually to fill the gap, as it were, and maybe like let's live code an operator might be a good one, or like let's do a session, like that sort of thing. So maybe we can pursue that as well. I don't know if that would be interesting or helpful. It might.
That sounds awesome. Like with so much combined knowledge in the room, I think that should be easy to get done.
Yes. Or we would like just debate whether it's Vim or Emacs for half an hour and never
Please don't. Please don't.
We all know the correct answer. I'm sure it's fine.
Cool. Any last questions before we wrap up? Okay. Have a great day, everyone, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.